For this drawstring bag, you need 2 pieces of fabric that are 45 by 55 centimeters. This specific size of fabric is also known as a fat quarter, which is a term for a pre-cut piece of fabric that is often used by quilters. For the color block effect, you need 2 colors, and prints should be non-directional. And that means that if you turn the print upside down, it still looks good. So even though these prints are very cute, I'm not going to use them for this bag. So in my case, I trimmed off the self edge of the fabric, but I was still left with a piece of fabric that was 45 by 55 centimeters. If your fabric piece ends up a little bit smaller after trimming off the self edge, don't worry, it's only slightly going to affect the proportions. I've aligned the 2 pieces right sides together and then folded it in half so that I can cut 4 strips that are 5 by 55 centimeters long. As I'm going to focus on the bag first, I'm going to put them aside for now. After cutting off the strips, you should have 2 pieces of fabric that are 35 by 55 centimeters. Fold 1 fabric panel in half and crease the center. We'll use the crease to mark the tunnel opening. The total for the tunnel opening will be 5 centimeters or 2 inches. So 2.5 centimeters on each side of the crease, or in inches, 1 inch on either side of that center crease. I realized you couldn't really see the crease on screen, so here's me marking said crease. And repeat the step on the other side. Since I'm working on the wrong side or the inside of the fabric and the right sides of the fabric are already facing each other, this is ready to sew. We're going to sew around 3 edges and leave one of the short sides open for access to the tunnel opening later. And yes, it might seem weird that we're also closing up the tunnel opening for now, but there's a good reason and I'll explain that later. I'm sewing with a 1 centimeter seam allowance, but in hindsight, I think 1.5 centimeters or maybe half an inch would have been better. It would have been easier to finish the tunnel opening, and once we get there, you'll understand. Once you get to the tunnel opening, backstitch a couple of times, and then dial up the stitch length, make it as big as your sewing machine goes, and then keep stitching until you reach the second marking, do a couple of back stitches, turn down the stitch length again, and keep sewing. And once you get to the corners, the only thing you have to worry about is if the fabric is still nicely aligned, but you don't have to be too precise about the stitching because we're going to cut them out later. We're going to repeat the steps for the tunnel opening. So backstitch before you reach the marking. Turn up the stitch length. So past that second marking and then backstitch again and decrease the stitch length. Next, we're going to prep the tunnel opening and start by pressing open the sides where the opening will be. Make sure you press the side seam open right up to the corner of the bag, since we're going to close the bag later on and you won't have as easy an access as you have right now. As I said earlier, the 1 centimeter seam allowance, while it does work, it is a little bit fiddly because we are going to fold it under itself, which makes it a little bit tricky. And this is also why I sewed that tunnel shut in the first place, so that it's easier to work with at this stage. So once we fold this seam allowance under and sew around the edge, we're going to open it up. So if you're looking at this and think my fine motor skills could never, then go ahead and widen that seam allowance. You don't even have to adjust the size of the fabric in the beginning. You can just sew it at a different width. It does affect the proportions slightly, but not in a really noticeable way. When you're pressing the seam allowance, make sure that you press at least 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch past where the tunnel opening is. This way, once you have it under the sewing machine or under the presser foot, you have a bigger area that's nice and flat, which makes it easier to work with. Also, don't be like me. I kept blasting my fingertips with steam. If you're this close to your iron, just turn off the steam function. One thing I like to do is extend the markings to both sides of the seam allowance, because once this project is under the sewing machine, you have a lot of fabric bunched up and it's a little bit difficult to see what you're doing. So that way I know where to start and stop and make my life a little bit easier. To sew around the tunnel opening, I'm going to be working on the inside of the bag. Once I have the project where I think it should be, I do a double check to see that there's no fabric under the presser foot that shouldn't be there. And then I sew as close to the folded edge as I can. To make sure that I have a nice and straight stitch line, I line a little ridge in the presser foot with the seam where the two fabric panels meet. And to hit the corner exactly where I want to, I use the hand wheel. As always, if you're sewing a corner, make sure that the needle is down when you pivot your project. Since I didn't backstitch at the start, I'm going to do that now and backstitch over those first few stitches so that I secure the thread. Now that the seam allowance around the tunnel opening is fully enclosed, it's time to use a seam ripper and open up the tunnel opening. Of course, it's best to do this on a solid underground because I almost seam rippered. Is that a word? Seam rippered. I almost ripped open the cover of my sleeve ironing board. So do as I say, don't do as I do. As you can see, there are some threads poking out of the tunnel opening. You want to clean that up and then we can move on to the other side. Now it's time to close up the bag. Keep in mind that if you use a wider seam allowance instead of the 1 centimeter seam allowance that I'm using, you need to be consistent and also use that for this part. Because this seam needs to match the one on the other side of the bag, otherwise that center crease that we made at the beginning doesn't fall in the center anymore and your tunnel opening will be slightly off. Before we mark the corners and clip them, give them a quick press. I'm marking a little 7 by 7 centimeter square that I'm going to cut out, but you can easily experiment with the depth of the bag. So if you want the boxed bottom a little bit less deep, you could do 5 centimeter, which is 2 inch, for example. And then you're going to cut out all 4 corners. To box the corner, pull on the inside corner of the little cutout that you made and align the side seams. Finger press the side seams open and use a pin to keep it all in place. It is a bit fiddly, but it pays off to take your time and get the pin straight through where the stitches are of the side seams are. Because if you get it right, after you turn the bag, the side seams will match up perfectly. Now you're going to work your way all around the bag. Once you've boxed all the corners and put a pin in it, I find it easiest to mark where the seam allowance is. So I'm going to go around and mark all my seam allowances at 1 centimeter. Or in inches, 3/8 of an inch. Now it's not necessary to mark your seam allowance, I just find it a lot easier, especially since where you start stitching is at an angle. And it's just a little bit harder to align your project to the ruler that's on the base plate of the sewing machine. So it's just a little step to make your life easier. Since the edge of your project is at an angle, it can be a little bit tricky to get started and guide it through the sewing machine when you're backstitching. So I find it helpful, again, to use the thread tails, put some tension on it and help guide it through the sewing machine. I love how the bag starts to get this three-dimensional shape once you've boxed all the corners. Now you're almost done. All we need to do now is turn the bag through the tunnel opening. So you want to reach in with a couple of fingers, grab one of the corners and pull them through. And now in the moment of truth, do the seams line up at the corners or not? Honestly, I wouldn't worry about it too much, but it is fun when they do line up. Once you have the bag turned right side out, grab the bag at the height of the tunnel and push one of the sides into the other one. Poke the corners into each other, so the inside corners into the outside corners, and then align the edge of the tunnel. Once you have the ends of the tunnel aligned, you want to make sure that the top looks straight and then sew all around the edge. Use the ruler on the base plate of the sewing machine to align your work. The top edge of the tunnel should be butted against a 2.5 centimeter marking or the 1 inch marking. As I was sewing, I decided it would be easier to remove the container because then I can drape the project around the free arm of the sewing machine. However, I forgot to put the needle down, so my project moved, but I don't think you can see it in the end result. And since I've been sewing in a circle, I didn't backstitch at the start, but it is what I'm going to do now because I can backstitch over the starting few stitches and secure the thread. One thing I like to do is pull aside the thread tails from where I started stitching. That way they're not going to nest together when I'm backstitching. The bag is all sewn and I think it looks good. Now it's time to tackle the drawstrings. And I like to sew them at a 45-degree angle. Because doing it at an angle, at a 45-degree angle, means that the seam allowances won't be too bulky. And especially in a tunnel with a cloth drawstring, bulk is something you want to reduce. Also, something to note is that I'm sewing all the strips together, but you don't have to. You only need to combine 2 strips at a time, but I find it easier to handle if it's in one long piece. If you're looking at this and wondering, why am I backstitching? Well, I'm wondering the same thing. It's not necessary to backstitch here. The edge of the seam will be encased and backstitching will only cause trouble. It will add bulk in a place where you don't want it. Luckily, I realized after the first one, so I didn't do it on the second 2 seams. And because I have to start the stitch line at an angle, I try to sort of chain piece them together and help guide them through the sewing machine. After sewing, snip off the excess corners and press open the seam allowance. After I've pressed open the seams, I'm going to press the rest of the drawstring in 4 passes. First, I'm going to fold it in half and press in a center crease. And even though it is time consuming, but I find that if you use one hand to sort of rock back and forth the fabric strip to align the raw edge, it's not that bad and you get this really satisfying result. And for the second pass of pressing, you're going to take one of those raw edges and fold it inward towards that center crease you just pressed in. And then once you've done this first pass on one side, you're going to repeat this step on the other raw edge. One thing to look out for though is you don't necessarily want the raw edges touching in the middle. It's fine if you leave a small gap between the two. What you don't want is overlapping, because again that will create bulk in a place where you don't want it. And for the final pass, we're going to fold the strip in half again and align the folded edges. It's one of those tasks that when you spend time pressing and get it right, it's going to be so much easier once you're behind the sewing machine. So earlier on in the project, I talked about how nice it is to sew the strips together on an angle. And here you can see the result of the seam allowance and that it's not stacked on top of each other. So way less bulk than you'd expect. All we have left to do for the drawstring is top stitch close to the edge. When I have to do some top stitching like this, I tend to start off by adjusting the position of the needle, and I think about how I want to place the project under my presser foot. So in this case, I'm aligning the folded edges to the little gap in my presser foot. And once I'm happy with my choice of how everything's set up, I think about how I want to place my hands. All I'm doing here for this strap is position my hands as a guide. I don't really handle the strap that much, I just let it slide through my fingers. And at this point, you'll still see my hands moving quite a bit, but I'm searching for the best position. But once I get going, I hardly move my hands or fingers and I just go slow and steady. I did have to start and stop quite a few times for some stray threads, but I just push them in with my finger or a seam ripper and keep going. Once you're done top stitching, you can snip it in half and it's ready to insert in the tunnel. And we're going to install the strips in a opposite direction so that once they're in and you pull on them, the bag is going to close itself. I'm going to use my loop turner from Prim. I've had it for, 24 years and I really love it, but you really also don't need it. If you have a safety pin or something like that, then that's going to work just fine to insert the drawstring. And as I'm inserting the drawstring, I want to make sure that the purple side is on the green tunnel and the green drawstring side is in the purple tunnel. Of course, you can do it however you want, but I think it's a fun detail when the colors are contrasting and are on the other side. And for the final steps, we're going to tie a knot in the drawstring and snip the ends on an angle. Now, if you snip the ends on an angle, they won't fray.